Welcome. Today is a ZBrush class. It is a continuation of the class that we had last week. So last week, if you guys remember, we had this introduction to ZBrush class. Very basic class. We've pretty much just went over the interface and we started sculpting a few things together there, a dog, a cat, and we started looking at like a whole bunch of like other stuff. And today we will be building on top of that knowledge that we have started to introduce last week there. So things are still going to be somewhat basic in nature to make sure that we cover all the bases and that we have covered everything that is important within ZBrush to know to be able to successfully sculpt characters and other things there. But things will already start to get a lot more interesting this week. Let me show you guys what is the course outline for today. Let me just go ahead here and share my screen. Let me do that. Let me bring this down here. Got this nice little dog and cat now as a wallpaper. It's kind of nice. Kind of like it. All right. Yeah. So today it's pretty much all about working with subdivisions then. So last week, like we really talked about Dynamesh mostly. That's really what we focused on 100%. And today we will put Dynamesh on the side and we will talk about the second mode of working within ZBrush that is called subdivision. So subdivision is actually very different than working in Dynamesh. In fact, a lot of the tools even are completely different. There are tools that work only in subdivision mode, and there are tools that only work in Dynamesh mode. Of course, ZBrush being the endless box of secrets that it is, you would probably be hard-pressed to know which one is which just by sort of staring at them. But you'll see that there's a lot of things that we'll start to introduce today that if you try to apply them to your Dynamesh workflow, they're not actually going to work. So it's really good to keep that in mind. Working in subdivision and working in Dynamesh, they're really often very, very different, very opposed in terms of workflow there. So the beginning of the class, the first part of the class today, you'll have a feeling that it is completely disconnected from everything that we have said last week. And for that very reason, the whole workflow is completely different. The tools are completely different when we're working in subdivision versus working in a Dynamesh. So you'll see that for the first part of the class, you guys will be like, well, this doesn't feel as a continuation of last week's class as much as just like a whole brand new content there that we have never seen before. But after the break, we'll start to bridge all of these two different ways of working together as we start to introduce workflows that are more related to working with scan data and stuff like that. So I think the second part of the class is going to be very interesting, even for those who maybe have a bit of experience already working inside of ZBrush. I'll try to show you guys a few tips and tricks there. Nothing too crazy, nothing too complicated, but you'll see that there's with just a big bit of basic knowledge, and if we have a few interesting scan data at our disposal, we can start to do some pretty interesting stuff by combining all the tools and all the features that we'll speak about today, and certainly with other stuff that may or may not have been or have started its life in Dynamesh there. So I will keep you guys hanging for that, but you'll see that it's going to get pretty interesting for the second part of the class, I think. So yeah, today essentially just a few housekeeping bits to get out of the way really quickly. We won't have a lot to talk about there today. So before the break then, it's going to be pretty much all about talking about the subdivision mode, simply exploring all the little tools left and right. You'll see we'll be kind of jumping through a lot of little tools, little functions left and right. They're all very important. So it's really important that you understand all of them. They're not all applied when we sculpt organic characters, but a lot of them are very useful. And some of them will also start to introduce you into a more hard surfacey workflow there, because subdivision is also something that is very interesting as a workflow to explore when you want to do more hard surface stuff. So we don't have a hard surface class today, but I do want to at least present a few tools that are related to that, so that if you feel that you are adventurous and want to start exploring that on your side, you'll at least know where to find the basic tools, and you can start to explore those by yourself there. We will eventually record hard surface classes, by the way, on outgang.studio. That is certainly the ambition there. And yeah, so that's pretty much exploring the subdivision mode, and then talking just very briefly about perhaps what we call Z-modeler and dynamic subdivision. We'll cover the first part of the class. We'll have our break, just like always. And then after that, we will talk about how to use ZWrap and how to manage and how to use scan data. There's a few little tips and tricks there I want to show you guys, and maybe you don't know about, even if you have used ZWrap in the past, which is mostly just a way to combine scan data with perhaps another head that you have sculpted, or blending scan data together and stuff like that. You'll see, I'll try to really expand your mind as to what are the possibilities there. And we won't do any sort of crazy retopology together. That's why ZWrap is there. It will allow us to use a head that we have previously retopologized on a brand new head, or a brand new head sketch that we have created ourselves. So on the website, so on outgang.studio, I have posted a handout already that you guys can actually go and you can download. And so the handout for this week, we do have one. It is essentially a full retopologized head. So if you guys go to the website, let me just do that here. Let's go to outgang.studio. Once we go to learn here and we click on our brand new class for today, you guys can already go ahead and download the handout, and that is a retopologized head. It is yours to keep, yours to use, and do whatever you want with it. I'll show you guys right now what it actually looks like. So hopefully that's gonna be a nice shortcut for you guys, because if we are character artists, it means that often we don't really like to retopologize heads. And like other stuff. It's weird. I mean, some people really like it. Other people don't. It kind of really varies there, but I'm sometimes more or less assuming that people don't necessarily like it. And yeah, so let me just show you guys what this actually looks like. Here is our handout for this week. This nice little base head. You can see super clean topology. You guys can take that, can start sculpting whichever head you want on top of that. It is yours to keep. And yeah, so I hope it becomes very, very useful. Of course, if you don't know what the colors here means, we'll talk about those later. And I'll be certainly explaining everything related to that to you guys. So yeah, let me start ZBrush here. In fact, I have already started it here. So this is pretty much the handout for this week, as I have said, and I want to start to really break down what is the subdivision mode of ZBrush, how it is different from working in Dynamesh, and also using that in the context of a more practical context here, if we have a head with us or not. Let me just put this on top here so that I can keep an eye on it. So this is a head that's been retopologized in an external program. Think I made it in 3ds Max, but that was done actually a while ago. So, essentially, you want to import an OBJ in here, or you want to import a base head like that you have created inside an external program. Simply have to load it as an OBJ, of course. You click Import 3D Mesh here. It allows you to select an OBJ or perhaps an FBX that you have. So if you already have another mesh somewhere that you want to use with the subdivision mode of ZBrush, you would import it in ZBrush like this. And once it is imported, well, you're pretty much gonna, like, your interface pretty much gonna look like this here, right? You're gonna have your head right in the middle, or your other object, and you're pretty much just gonna see the polygons here. In fact, you're not even gonna see these. So let me go ahead and just delete that here. We try the polygroups, which we'll talk about in just a minute there. But yeah, so once you import something inside of ZBrush from an external program, or perhaps even if you use one of these primitives here, you're pretty much going to wind up being at the same spot, right? You pretty much wind up having a low res made with polygons that are usually way too low res for you to be able to really sculpt on top, right? And so that's where the notion of subdivision becomes interesting. Because so far, what we've done last week is that we would have taken this, we would have cranked up the resolution, or perhaps not, depending on for our Dynamesh, we would have converted this to a Dynamesh, and we would have just gone to town and started to sculpt on this, right? But the subdivision mode of ZBrush is a very different way of working. It does not work like this at all. In fact, the subdivision mode of ZBrush is older than Dynamesh. Even though we started by learning Dynamesh first, because I think that Dynamesh is simply more intuitive in terms of sculpting experience. There's less subtleties about it too that can throw you sort of in for a bad experience. The subdivision mode is actually the older one of the two. So this is pretty much how it was back in ZBrush 2 when I started learning ZBrush there. We pretty much had only subdivision mode. In fact, there was not even any Dynamesh in there to speak of. And so the workflow using subdivision is something that is very old and well understood for sure. And the idea is that you want to sculpt the head, you want to sculpt nice details on it. Well, you kind of have to increase the resolution of your mesh, right? Just like with the Dynamesh slider, you would increase that slider to get more polygons out of your surface there. We kind of more or less do the same thing, but in a very different way, using a mesh here that is in subdivision mode. So the idea here, the basic idea, is that you go to your geometry menu right here. So in your tool palette, you go to geometry. And once you open this here, so this is something we haven't talked about at all last week. In fact, let me even go over here and switch back to my default interface. So for those of you who don't are very new here, so that you're not completely lost when you look at my interface there, that's going to be a lot better, I think. Yeah, so in geometry, right, pretty much the only thing that we've concerned with ourselves so far is the Dynamesh menu entry right here. Right, but there's all this complexity. There's all these buttons right on top of it, And so the basic workflow when you work in subdivision is you start with your head or whichever object you want to sculpt on, right? And then you pretty much just go to town with this with the move brush. You start to change the proportions. You start doing essentially the basic manipulations to the mesh. If you need to make some, of course, just like you would with a Dynamesh that is of a very low resolution Dynamesh, right? So the starting point is more or less the same. You just go in here and you change your proportions if you want to make a head that's going to look a lot different there. So the brushes are certainly the same, but eventually you're like, okay, well, there's really just a very small amount of stuff I can do with this particular head. At some point, I really have to subdivide it so that I can get more polygons out of this, so that I can start sculpting on it at a higher resolution. And that is where we start to introduce all these little buttons that you guys can see in our geometry menu right here. So let me just take a sip of my tea that does not have milk, by the way, very important. Because I'm drinking hojicha right now, which I believe is Japanese tea, and I don't believe that that would probably be a crime to put some milk in a Japanese tea. Who would do such a thing? You can sort of tell that I'm drinking Japanese tea, because if I was drinking British tea, I would probably keep my finger like this. So you can kind of tell what am I drinking. Maybe that's a stereotype, by the way. I apologize if there's British people here. I hope I have not offended you. So, yeah, back to this here, right? So in our geometry menu right here, so we have this big button here that is written divide there. And if you simply click on that, you will subdivide your head and you will essentially increase the polygon density that you have in there. So you could ask the question, cool, can I do it a second time? Sure, you can. There you go. You have even more polygons to speak of. And if I go back in here and take my standard brush or clay tubes or something else, right? And we start sculpting on this, you can see that now I have a lot more resolution to sculpt on than what I had before, right? And we can keep going. I can divide once more. There's this nice little slider here that actually appears. So right over the divide button, you guys can see here that there's a few buttons here that have now activated themselves. First of all, there's this little slider here. We can go up and down in our subdivision levels. That's fantastic because that is a big part of the workflow when we work with subdivisions, just to play and always kind of change the subdivision level that we have, We'll certainly talk more about that later a little bit, but like one of the great things about working in subdivision is that we do have that dynamic control over the resolution there. So you can kind of already imagine at this point, right? It's like if I want to sculpt very tiny details on this head, probably should do it at the highest subdivision level, so that I can go in here and I can start to sculpt some really tiny details over the surface. Not as tiny as we could. We will make them even tinier later. But if I want to make some major changes to the surface of my model, I should probably do it at a lower subdivision level. Now, you don't technically need to do that. I can go in here, take my move brush, of course, can start to push and pull on this without any sort of problems, and the details certainly follow. But it's good to know that usually um, you want to be working at a resolution that is of a slightly um, that is somewhat equivalent to the kind of size of manipulation you want to do to your surface. All right, that's kind of weird what I just said. Um, but try to think about that. Like, if you want to make some really large proportional changes to your head, you want to be bringing the subdivision slider all the way down as much as possible so that you can go in here and you can take your head and you can start doing these really, really big changes to it. And here I can change the proportions of my head. I can do all sorts of things with this if I want. And so usually you kind of want to be working like if you're going to do some really major changes to your head, you more or less want to start to do it at a lower subdivision level. And if you want to start to concentrate on the smaller details, then you want to usually do it at a higher resolution level. And I will show you guys why in just a minute, why that is important. But first of all, I'm not really satisfied with this. By the way, we can see here on the top the number of points that I have here on my head right now. And so right now we're at about 200,000 points. These aren't they certainly are vertices, but they're not polygons, but there's a very linear sort of equivalent relationship there between the number of polygons and the number of vertices that you have. Actually, I think it's the number of triangles that you have. So, although these are vertices, you can more or less consider they're the number of triangles or number of polygons you have on your head there. I usually use these interchangeably. So it really just gives you a pretty good idea of the order of magnitude of things, you know? So right now we're at about 200,000 vertices on our head, or, about 200,000 triangles, polygons, these sorts of things. Technically polygons are double the number of triangles, but, as far as we're concerned today, that distinction doesn't really matter there. So yes, we're about 200,000 right now, so, and we can start to like already kind of get something here that we would have to crank the dynamesh resolution pretty high to be able to get something pretty solid here, or as equivalent, if you will, in terms of resolution there, right? But it's good to know that subdivision mode, you can go a lot further than that. So why don't we divide again and then see what happens? All right. So now we're at about 700,000 vertices, and I'm getting even sharper details. But if I'm to be honest, that's still not very high. Let's crank it up once more. So right now we're at 6 subdivision levels. So we're getting at 3 million polygons right now. That's, if you throw this in Marvel, in Maya or in 3ds Max, the things will start to slow down quite a lot right now. These two software don't handle polygons nearly as well as ZBrush does. So even at 3 million here, you're in ZBrush and it's like, yeah, I can still sculpt on this. See how nice my sculpting experience still is on this particular head. Life is good, It's like I'm not getting any sort of slowdowns. It's like ZBrush doesn't care about 3 million polygons. It really doesn't care at all. So why don't we try to see if we can increase it once more then? There you go. Now we're at 6. I thought we were at 6 before. That's weird. Okay, yeah, I'm back to 3 million. There you go. Why don't we subdivide it once more? Here we go. 12 million polygons. We got 12 million polygons on this head. Now you've completely killed 3ds Max and Maya. They're all not going to be able to support that. Fortunately, I can't speak for Blender. I don't know how well it supports polygons, but I assume it probably supports it a lot better than these two softwares I've mentioned before. Yeah, see how nice this sculpting experience is? Can we go even higher? Sure. Why don't we do it again? Let's divide again. By the way, shortcut for this, Control D, as you can see when I put my cursor over it. Control D, let's do it again. How much are we going to wind up with? How much? Okay, now it's starting to slow down a little bit, right? Here we go. 50 million polygons. Cool. How is the sculpting experience? Okay. Starting to be, we're starting to see a bit of smoke that is sort of coming out here of ZBrush, but still, I mean, this is this is pretty workable, right? 50 million polygons. We got 50 million polygons on this head right now. How far do you think we can zoom in here and start sculpting details in there? If I zoom in on this on the face and I bring my brush stroke to be tinier and tinier, what does that look like? Whoa, look at that resolution. That's crazy, right? Can go in here and start sculpting some really crazy details, super sharp, super small. Can we zoom on that even more? How far can we go? If I zoom in on this even more and I bring my brush size even smaller down. Whoa, look at that. Crazy, right? Okay, now finally, when I'm this close here, I can start seeing the polygons. But look at how crazy high res all of this is. Look at how incredibly sharp. Let me use the brush here that we call the orb cracks. It doesn't come with ZBrush, unfortunately, but you can Google that. It's a really nice brush to sculpt some hard surfacey looking lines over a surface. Look at that. Look at how crazy sharp that is. Let's zoom out. Let's zoom out again. Let's zoom out. Look at how tiny that is. It's so small, right? So that's the advantage of working with subdivisions. It is extremely performant. It will allow you to work with meshes that are extremely dense and to work on the smallest, tiniest possible detail that you could want. Now, that is true, of course. You kind of need a computer that supports it too, though. That kind of goes without saying. If you guys are still running a Pentium 4, I don't think that you'll be able to go that high. But it's good to know that like you can crank the resolution high, even if you have a relatively modest machine. In fact, whichever machine you have, really, you'll always be able to crank the resolution of your surface way further when you are in subdivision mode than if you are in Dynamesh there. So, you may not necessarily be able to go up to 50 million in every instance, but pretty much every modern computer can, at the very least, make it very easily up to maybe about 3 to 5 million polygons without a problem, usually, for anything that you're sculpting. And, even if I bring this down here to about subdivision number 6, right? You can see here that we're back down to like about 3 million here. And I'm still getting like some really nice, really crisp details if I want out of my surface there. So that's the advantage of working in subdivision. Now, you could ask me, Laura, why didn't you teach me this last week? What's up with you? Why start with Dynamesh and all these ugly polygons? And why bother with that if we have this thing here that allows us to crank out all these extremely high density tertiary details? Um, well, it's pretty much because of that. I consider the subdivision mode is actually a mode that is more tailored towards creating tertiary details. So, which means skin pores, wrinkles, all these tiny little details that you would want to just pitch over a surface. That for me is what subdivision really excels at. But if you really think about it, do you really want to start with that? Do you want to be one of those character artists that focuses on skin pores to the detriment of the anatomy of your face and the proportions of your face? I hope the answer is no. But unfortunately, that's how a lot of people start. They overvalue the value of those tertiary details and they undervalue the value of proportions, anatomy, and really nailing those down perfectly there. So in a way, the limited resolution of Dynamesh, I actually consider that it's a bit of an advantage because it focuses you, it forces you to concentrate yourself on the on simply getting some very nice shapes, some very nice anatomy, and some very nice proportions. But it's also good to know that subdivision mode has incredible limitations too that you also have to deal with. Because you see, this is a head here. So, of course, if we're just sculpting a head, perhaps I can actually load a head. Why don't I load a head at the same time it's been completed so that we can also talk about that? Why not? That should be interesting, right? Just looking at a random head here for a few random brushstrokes may not be that interesting. Why don't I load this Mads Mikkelsen head that I keep showing to people for the last few years? God, I need to finish another project, guys. Uh, but I'm just too busy trying to just bring value to you guys that I don't have a lot of time to focus on projects, unfortunately. But at some point, I certainly will. Yeah. So think about it this way, right? Dynamesh is meant for sketching. Subdivision is meant for making a final polished piece, if you will. All right, here's my Mads Mikkelsen head. By the way, I want to tell you guys too, like this class today really segues really nicely into next week's class because next week's class will be a class dedicated fully to creating tertiary details. So I don't want to speak too much about that today, but I do want to talk about it a little bit. So I'm on my default interface, so now I'm completely confused. I'm like, where's the buttons that I need now? Because I don't usually use this interface, but I will be uncomfortable for today because it's going to be better for you guys. Let me just crank up here the light intensity here. And why don't I also go into my material modifiers, take this little value here called anisotropic diffuse, put it at 0.1. There you go. It just helps to spread the lighting over the surface in a way that's a bit better there. So this whole head here is in subdivision, right? If I go here and I check out the resolution here, you guys can see I'm at subdivision 7. Right now, I have about 12 million polygons. It's a good place to start. Really, truth be told, you don't really need to go over that usually for faces, unless you plan on doing some really crazy close-ups, But if you get to about 12 million polygons for your face, you're in a pretty good spot. You'll be hard pressed to get advantage out of having more polygons over your surface. So in all reasonableness, this is usually the the value that's the better one at which to stop there, I think. Because like even 3 million sometimes it's not always enough for face, 3 to 5 million sometimes still isn't quite enough sometimes for faces to get some really sharp, really crisp details. But 12 million for me is the sweet spot. Like this is where you should probably stop in most instances. Even if I have a computer that allows me to go to 50 million, most of the time it's not worth it because it does start to slow down a lot, and your Z tool will start to be extremely heavy on your computer there. So, yeah, words of wisdom, I suppose. Um, but yeah, so you want to create all these crazy tertiary details. You do it in subdivision mode. That's kind of how it goes. You can't do that in Dynamish. But yeah, it's good to know that I can still edit the resolution here if I want to go down, if I want to go back up, these sorts of things. So in terms of limitation there, what are the limitations of the subdivision mode, and why is it that we don't necessarily always want to be working in subdivision mode, even though from the surface, it sounds like a really awesome way to work, right? And why did I teach you guys Dynamish to begin with? Well, the big problem you see with subdivision mode, the big problem is that you can probably already kind of guess you are polygon bound. You are polygon bound because every time you subdivide your object or you go to a higher subdivision level to your object, you are subdividing the polygons that already exist there, right? So we take this huge polygon here. I'm going to press D on my keyboard to go up to the next subdivision level, by the way. So the shortcuts, I haven't mentioned them. Control D subdivides. So it adds one extra subdivision level on top of the stack, if you will, of subdivision levels you already have, provided you are at the highest subdivision level to begin with, else it's not going to work. But as you play through this little slider here, if you want to go down a subdivision level, the shortcut for that is Shift D. And if you want to go up, the shortcut for that is D, simply. So D goes up, as you can see. Shift D goes down. And once we are at our highest subdivision level, if we want to add a subdivision on top of that, then we press Control D. It's kind of how it goes there. But yeah, so the limitation is that we are polygon bound. We are subdividing polygons. And that's a problem because, if we are starting from a sphere and we want to just sketch out ahead, we don't really know what we want to do yet. Like last week, we sculpted a dog and a cat head. You can imagine that since we are polygon bound, as you start to stretch the surface, there is nothing that you can rely upon to automatically recalculate or redynamish the surface, right? I mean, that's not technically true. There's workflows and stuff like that. But as far as today's concerned, it's better not to go there. So let me just do something here. And yeah, so, as if I was like, okay, I want to add some cat ears to Mads Mikkelsen because everything is better when there is cat ears on top of that. Uh, I have my draw size of like 1,000 already because scale of this scene is kind of screwed up because when I created this head, I didn't know any better. Yeah, so like I'm like, okay, I want to add some like cat ears to like Mads Mikkelsen because, or actually, no. Actually, since we're there, right? Since he plays Hannibal, let's add some nice little, yeah. He's like the devil, right? That's like kind of who he is. Why don't we do that here? So like, okay, let's do Mads Mikkelsen in Hannibal, right? And there's like a few moments where you see him with like antlers and stuff like that. Um, yeah, well, you can sort of imagine what starts to happen, right? You are stretching polygons, and because you're polygon bound, there's no way to get a nice smooth surface out of this. You can see the wireframe, how the wireframe is just becoming extremely stretched. It's really, really bad, right? And all of those tertiary details that have sculpted are now like super stretched. That's the problem when you work in subdivision mode. You cannot do major changes to your topology. You cannot do major changes to your proportions or add details that wasn't there in the surface to begin with. That is a limitation. That is why you do not want to start in subdivision, because you simply cannot start with a sphere and then start to express a shape that isn't a sphere. The moment that you stretch it, your topology is gonna pretty much go to shit pretty quickly. So yeah, it's better to keep subdivision mode for later, essentially. Now, how do you do that if you have something that's in Dynamesh? Well, you have two choices. One is you do a retopology, a manual retopology, or two. Actually, there's three choices. One, you do a manual retopology. Two, you do pipelines using Z remesher and stuff like that. We won't talk about that today. But there are pipelines there you could do within ZBrush to redynamesh, if you will, when you're in subdivision mode and stuff. And number three would be to use something like ZWrap if you're working on something like a head, which we'll explore after the break. So I won't say more on that now. But yeah, so just keep that in mind, the other thing that's good to know about working in subdivision that's very, very important is that if you start to use the smooth brush, if you use a smooth brush a lot, your smooth brush when you're subdivision mode is dependent upon the resolution of your surface. I mean, it's technically true of Dynamesh too, but at least when you're Dynamesh, since you can't play through subdivision levels, probably not going to realize that your smooth brush is dependent upon the resolution or the strength of your smooth brush, that is. So, you can kind of see what's going to happen here, right? I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to try to smooth here. And you can see that if I go over these kind of antlers, I'm starting to build upon his head there. I'm pretty much smoothing out those stretched sort of tertiary details I had there, but I'm not really changing in any way anything else really. Whereas if I go down a subdivision level, or at least let's go down all the way down here. So I could play with a slider here, but better to just do Shift D until we're at the lowest point here, right? If I'm at this point here and I use my smooth brush again, now I can actually just smooth these out and just very, very quickly there. So the strength of your smooth brush depends upon the resolution of your subdivision mode. Yeah, so just keep that in mind, like if you're like, yeah, I'm smoothing this, but it's just not disappearing or something like that, just bring the resolution down. and then you'll be able to flatten the surface a lot better. So just something to keep in mind. There's other subtleties about smooth and subdivision and stuff like that. We'll explore those when the time is right. But that's kind of all I want to say on that. Okay, let's take a specific use case where you are somehow you're here and you've clicked on this little button here that says delete lower subdiv level. And then you're like, oh, that's not good. My subdivision levels are gone. And now ZBrush is extremely slow because there are no more subdivision levels here. And so we have 12 million polygons. If I press Shift F to show the wireframe, you can see what this looks like. It's just a soup of black. It's just blackness, as Mads Mikkelsen would certainly like, I'm sure. So very representative. Yeah, so you're like, well, I'm kind of screwed now. I just deleted all my subdivision levels and I haven't even realized that I've kind of done that there. There's this little button here. All right, guys, if you're stuck like that, you can always reconstruct your subdivision level, right? So think of this as the inverse of that here. Divide, add subdivision levels. Think about it this way. Reconstruct goes the other way. Reconstruct kind of builds or sort of simplifies your subdivision level. It's like an inverse division, if you see what I mean. Right? Let's click on that here. And you can see that now I will also start to have entries in my little subdivision slider that starts to appear. But now I can continuously go further and further down. Now, this isn't actually magical, okay? This only works if your mesh was subdivided to begin with. Because, if you were to import a random triangle soup in here, ZBrush would be like, I don't know. There's no way for me to reconstruct this, So this really only works if something had been subdivided to begin with, but it's very useful. It's very useful in certain cases. Let's say that you have started sculpting on head like this, that is in subdivision mode. And that at some point, perhaps something else that kind of happened to you. You inadvertently pressed Shift X on your keyboard, and now you have turned off. Now you have suddenly turned off symmetry. Kind of happens once in a while. Let's just wait here. You can see that, like, the further down you go into the reconstruction, the slower it gets. That process is not instantaneous for the lower levels, but usually it's pretty. It's not too bad. Yeah. So let's say that you're like, cool. All right, this is awesome. All right. I'm sculpting here. Like maybe like our camera is like even like this, and you start to sculpt. And you're like, okay, I'm kind of adding something here. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just adding some random details here. You're like, cool. I want something like this over my character. He's got this huge cyst. He's got a huge tumor that's just growing